The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, will Doug Ford's early election call pay off? Then, Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie joins us to discuss her party's plans for Ontario. That's all next on the agenda. And they're off. Premier Doug Ford visited Edith Dumont yesterday, advising the Lieutenant Governor to dissolve the legislature and draw up the writs for this, our 44th general election. There will be myriad issues that we will discuss between now and Election Day, which is February 27th. But clearly, the big issue for discussion on day one is, can the Premier justify calling this election nearly a year and a half before he needed to? Let's get some analysis of that with John Mikatishin, conservative political consultant and public opinion researcher. Kim Wright, principal and founder of Wright Strategies and an NDP strategist. Dan Moulton, partner at Crestview Strategy and a Liberal strategist. Richard Southern, Queen's Park reporter for 680 News Radio. And Sabrina Nanji, journalist and founder of the Queen's Park Observer. And it's great to have the cast of Ben-Hur here at our table here today. We got so much wisdom, starting with... No, I'm not going to start with you guys. I'm going to give the Premier the first word here, shall we? Sheldon, if you would, a clip.
Right now, President Trump has put uncertainty. Has put uncertainty to every single Canadian, a lot of other countries around the world. And this isn't going to happen overnight. May not happen February 1st. I'm sure something's coming, but this is going to be a battle for the next 4 years. And I want to make sure that I have a strong mandate to outlast President Trump.
Okay, let's go around the table and find out. John, to you first. How legitimate a reason is this for calling an early election?
Anytime a premier decides it's time for an election, it is all the legitimacy he needs.
That is legally true, constitutionally true, traditionally true, but he's still got to make a sale to the people of Ontario.
Well, the whole election, any election, is about one thing, and that's the ballot question. So the Premier's come out with the Trump effect, and he has said that the new president is an existential threat to the humanity, specifically Ontario, and that's why he needs another 4-year mandate to match Trump's term. What will be interesting is, I expect the Premier to be reelected, is when Trump gets constitutional revision so he can go for a third term, if the Premier will be going again in 4 years.
That is a very mischievous thing for you to say. Kim, your view on this?
Look, the Premier's been telegraphing this. It's crass politics. They've been telegraphing this since it was warm outside in June and July that this was going to be it. This is why they had the rebate checks, the Doug bucks, were supposed to land at the same time as the writs were being issued. Although many people will now know that those checks are bouncing, much like the electioneering promises we've heard from the Premier over the last few days. They're not worth the paper they're printed on.
Bouncing? What do you mean?
That some of those checks, when people are going to cash them, aren't being honored. So it becomes slightly problematic to when you're giving rebates to the electorate, not being able to follow through on this. Now they're trying to say there are all sorts of reasons and blaming all sorts of other folks, but much like the flurry of election promises we've heard and press releases over the last couple of days, not worth the paper they're printed on.
Dan.
Look, Doug Ford wants this election to be about Donald Trump. I think the reality is the reason this election was called early is because of Tim Houston, right? The reality is that the Premier of Nova Scotia called an election last year, and a lot of the same people advised the Premier of Nova Scotia go for an early election, and it worked out for him. The same people advised Doug Ford, go for an election early, it's going to work out for you. And that's the reason we're in an election right now. John's right. I mean, it's incumbent on the Liberals and the other opposition parties to reframe the question of this election on the ballot box to be about Doug Ford. That's what this has to be about, because he's the least popular premier in Canada. People are upset about the fact they can't get a family doctor. And if they show up voting on those issues, we're going to see a very different outcome than the one that was the legislature that was just dissolved.
Okay. You three are the partisan supporters. Let's find out from the neutral, objective journalist what you're hearing out there in terms of the legitimacy of the early call. Sabrina, what are you hearing?
Yeah, I think what we saw today on day one of the campaign was a race to define the race. Obviously, Doug Ford thinks the ballot box question is about Donald Trump and the threat of tariffs. To Kim's point, though, this is something that he has refused to rule out since last May. If you ask his political rivals, NDP's Marit Stiles, Liberals' Bonnie Crombie, or the Greens' Mike Schreiner, they say this is self-serving. Doug Ford already has a majority mandate, and what he needs to fight the tariffs, they're willing to support him on a tariff-fighting plan. They think that he's just trying to get out ahead of whatever the RCMP is looking into the green belt. That it's politically advantageous for him to go to the polls before the feds for many reasons. We know that Ontario tends to elect opposites at Queen's Park and the Hill. So there's a lot of reasons why this would be advantageous for Doug Ford. I think, as my co-panelists have pointed out, the onus is now on his rivals to remind people that, we've had this premier for the last 6 years, and are they happy with the state of healthcare, education, cost of living? So it really feels like it's a race to define the race.
For sure.
I mean, I'll be honest. I think there's a political risk for the premier using this justification, and I think, my fellow reporters may have poked some holes in that rationale just today on day one of the campaign when they said, okay, you want a mandate to deal with Donald Trump? Well, have you arranged a meeting with him yet? He announced the tariffs weeks ago. No, he hasn't. Did you meet with him during his first mandate when he also levied tariffs against Canada? No, I didn't meet with him or talk to him at the time. I don't think Donald Trump cares who the premier of Ontario is. And I would suggest maybe a lot of Ontarians understand it's kind of a federal issue to deal with Trump. So I think there's some risk for the premier in doing this, and maybe some of it shone through on day one of the campaign today.
Let me follow up with John on that. Mr. Ford did say at one point, can you imagine Bonnie Crombie or Marit Stiles across the table from Donald Trump negotiating on tariffs? It would be an absolute disaster, which presupposes, of course, that he will be doing that when we all know he really won't be doing that. So how far does that explanation really go?
Well, okay, so two parts to that. What do you say that the premier will follow in the footsteps of all the premiers who've gone before and negotiated deals with past presidents of the United States? Or you could say it doesn't really matter what he says. It's what do people believe? What do they think? Who do they want? So in an instance where you think you're worried about the future and what Trump might mean for Canada, it comes down to who is the person you want to be premier that you believe whatever the role is would be the best spokesperson, the best representative to protect you.
No, but that's what's really cynical about this decision to call the early election, is that Donald Trump isn't going to know who Doug Ford is through his entire 4 years in office. He's not going to sit across the table and negotiate with him. Doug Ford's never going to be involved in a conversation like that. What he's preying on is an expectation that the electorate aren't going to really care. They're not really going to tune into this election, and we're going to have as low voter turnout as we did in the last election, which all of us know was extremely low. It is cynical, and it's cynical that he called this election in the first place. That's the trouble that I'm trying to raise here.
We had 40%, about 40% turnout in the last election. So
but there are ridings where it was as low as 24%, right? I mean, across the GTA, there were 24% turnout in Brampton and places like that, right? There was very, very low numbers. And I think that's the risk that the premier is going to be coming up against, is if we don't see that low a turnout, people might show up with a different result.
The big risk, too, is he talking about the issues that Ontarians really care about? I mean, you look at the polling, people care about, health care. I think affordability is number one. And these are issues that the premier, the opposition would say is maybe a bit weak on. And here he is talking about Trump. I think that could be a risk for him.
Having said that, Kim, the premier, as John said, legally, constitutionally, is entitled to call the election when he wants to. We have a fixed election date law, but there's a loophole in it allowing him to go early. He is exercising what you might call his home court advantage. Isn't he entitled to do that?
Sure, that's the crass politics. When you're the premier, you get to call the election when you want. Now, all of that being said, Marit Stiles and the New Democrats have been fired up and ready to go on this election campaign. We've seen this on day one, the difference of how Marit Stiles showed up at her campaign launch versus, with a crowd around her, with really great energy, talking about her skills as a negotiator against U.S. multinationals. The things that matter, the things that brought her here from Newfoundland originally, a better life for her and her family. She also pointed out that Premier Ford, Doug Ford, has not been that good of a negotiator when it comes to deals like Ontario Place and the Science Centre that have left Ontarians lagging. But I also say that when I've looked at where the donors are coming from, where the candidates are coming from, where the race is going to intensify, she raised she's got about $10 million sitting in a campaign war chest, raised by 220,000 unique individual donors from across the province. Those are arms and legs that get us into traditional and non-traditional NDP territory.
Even if it's -5 outside?
Even when it's -5, these are folks who will go knock on those doors. They've got their toe warmers and their hand warmers. They're ready to go, and they're out on the hustings now. And it's really a fascinating place. And the comparison that we saw today, this introduction to Ontarians that the first day of the campaign brings, where you had Marit Stiles and then you had Bonnie Crombie. Now, Marit Stiles knocked it out of the park. Bonnie Crombie was standing in a parking lot and basically trying to hold on to her hat. It wasn't quite the good image.
Equal time for Dan on that one.
Well, I think Bonnie's coming up on this program very soon, and she'll deliver, I think, the clear message she's going to deliver throughout the campaign. And the reality is that voters in this province know who Bonnie Crombie is. They haven't got an idea who the leader of the New Democrat Party is. She hasn't shown up to work for the last 4 years. They're not. I know that your viewers know who she is, but the reality is people across this province know who Bonnie Crombie is because she's an electric leader. She's got a lot of charisma, a heck of a lot more than we had as Liberals in the last election. And I think we're going to see a very different outcome and a very different 28 days ahead of us.
Is this why she couldn't find a seat to run in, just out of curiosity? Because she's kind of been figuring that out for the last several months. Like, Mississauggans were,
Well, Bonnie left her job as mayor of Mississauga last year. She's going to run in Mississauga.
And I know she said,
I'm sure she'll be elected to the legislature in 20
And I know she said that, being leader has been hard for her. And I appreciate that. But so is apparently finding a seat because she doesn't really have one yet.
Well, she's running in Mississauga, East Cooksville for the record, and we're going to talk to her about it when she comes up after this. I want to ask you about winter elections, Sabrina. This is the first wintertime election we're having in this province in 44 years. There is generally an acknowledgement by most parties that you don't want a winter election because no one wants to canvass in a winter election and nobody wants to stand with an open door when it's cold out, when candidates come knocking on your door. I had a candidate the other day say, how am I going to get my signs in the lawn? Are you hearing any kvetching out there about that kind of stuff?
I have heard that from MPPs, from canvassers and organizers who aren't looking forward to, going and knocking on doors in frigid temperatures. I had one campaign manager tell me that he's going to, be working really hard to get those signs into a frozen ground. Another one suggested that it's easy to just stick them in a snowbank, but I think you've raised a good point. I mean, we heard from the Chief Electoral Officer today, Greg Asenza, about contingency plans in place in case there's a blizzard on E-Day and, people can't get to the polls. I think we might see, people voting during the advanced polls, but there are only 3 days of that because we're in this very short time period right now for the campaign. It's a snap vote, so instead of the 10 days for advanced voting, there's only going to be 3. And we know that, in the last election in 2022, turnout was essentially in the toilet. And now we know that low turnout tends to favor incumbents. Those are the Conservatives, and I think that's probably not lost on the strategists as well.
You're right. Of course you're right. You're the encyclopedia when it comes to Ontario political knowledge. That the most recent winter election was in 1981. But did you know there was an election held in Ontario on February 27th?
Feb 27th?
Yes.
What year?
You have no idea, Steve?
Wait a second. In Feb 27th?
I believe it was Feb 27th.
There was an Ontario election?
Yes. 1883.
Oh, I covered that one. I remember.
Oliver Mowat, re-elected. So there really is not a lot of precedence for a winter election, right?
Well played, Richard.
Yes.
That was good. That was good.
Stumped the great Steve Paikin. But I've heard the same thing that Sabrina's heard. There is concerns about the signs. MPPs have told me there's concern, too, about people not coming to the door to talk or not talking as long at the door. I would also suggest, the snowbird vote might not come in as well. So there's a lot of factors when you look at this winter election.
John, let me ask you, I want to know how concerned you are, because we're hearing it at this table here. Clearly the opposition parties want to enrage the electorate over the notion of an early, they would say unnecessary, $175 million election call. Do you think that can be exploited for the opposition's purposes to the point where people will actually take it out on Doug Ford on E-Day?
So the first part is, it's a two-part answer. And the first part is, first they have to be enraged. First they have to say, why now? The cost is going to be the cost, but a year from now. So is this a needless election? But the second part is, so not everybody will buy into that, and that's certainly a job for the opposition. But the second part of that is, okay, I'm mad that there's an election today. I'm a conservative. I'd rather get my full 4 years out of the last election, and I'm really annoyed at the premier. But who do I think would be the best premier? Who do I think is the best candidate in this next election? And if your conclusion is I'm really annoyed at the premier, but he's still the best one, then he doesn't pay a price for that. Then he still wins. Unless people sit at home, go on vacation, don't bother. Advanced polls, yes, that's a thing, but there's also another dynamic. You can go to the polls today and vote in your local returning office. That's one of the new things in the last couple elections has come about. You do not have to wait. You just have to find out where your local office is, go in today, and if they don't even have the ballots ready, because candidates aren't real yet, because there's a few days for that to happen, you just write in a name and they will count your ballot on election night. So I'm not worried about that. And there's a second part, which is, if I wasn't happy with the premier, who's better than him?
Well, a lot of people aren't happy with the premier. I mean, you look at the ranking of premiers across the country, he's the least popular premier in Canada.
But who's better than him?
Well, Styles, just to be clear.
Well, I think that the voters are going to have an opportunity to take a look at their options in this election.
But currently they don't know either of the leaders. That's part of their problem.
Well, I mean, the Conservatives spent a heck of a lot of money trying to besmirch Bonnie Crombie's name. They've put huge amount of advertising spending
only
into
millions and millions
to attack ads against her, trying to define her. And there's a reason for that. It's because people know who she is. She draws the attention of the media. She gets in the premier's head, and she's going to be on the stage in a big way throughout this campaign.
That is the expression. She lives rent-free in the premier's head.
That's right.
You have said that. Now, Richard, I did not, believe it or not, cover the election in 1883, but we want to give a couple of examples here of previous elections where, in fact, the opposition parties did try to demonize an early election call and what, in effect, did transpire. These ones did take place in my lifetime, actually. Sheldon, you want to bring up the first graphic here? Let's go back to 1975. The premier of the day was Bill Davis. His polls looked pretty good. He sat at 51 seats, and he thought, I'm going to try for an early election call. So he did, only not even 2 years later. But as you can see from these graphics here, he went from 51 to 58 seats. Liberals and New Democrats switched second and third place. But essentially, he tried with an early election call to turn his minority into a majority and failed because the public said, not going to do it. And the second one is a little more recent, although still 35 years ago.
I like this one.
This was Liberal Premier David Peterson, who had the biggest majority government in Ontario history in 1987, came in with 95 seats, called an early election after just 3 years, went down to a very bad second place, 36 seats. The NDP going from officially the opposition, but well back with only 19 seats to a majority government status at 74, and the Conservatives in third place in both of those elections. The point is, if on occasion you want to demonize the government for an early election call, it can work. Sabrina, are you seeing any signs out there that people can be made to be exercised about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's early days yet, of course, and this is going to be the line from the opposition. They're calling this an unnecessary election, plunging Ontario into chaos in an already chaotic times. The cost of the election will actually be $189 million because of inflation. The chief electoral officer told us that today. But you're right, you mentioned 1990, where that backfired on then Liberal Premier David Peterson, and got us our first and only ever NDP government in this province. I think that there are vulnerabilities, as Richard mentioned earlier, for Doug Ford here. If if people see this as self-serving, then they might punish him. But I don't know if that narrative is going to last throughout the campaign. Campaigns matter. There's a lot of other issues that are top of mind for people: cost of living, healthcare, housing. Actually, the Trump tariffs poll like around 5%. People say it's not really that high on their radar right now. If you are spending a lot at the grocery store and you're worried about your kids being able to afford a home, I don't know if you're really concerned with what Trump is doing south of the border. So we have seen this backfire, and it could work against Doug Ford.
So Kim, if it turns out that the early election call actually doesn't tick off people so much at the end of the day, Find another issue out there that you think you can exploit that the Premier is more vulnerable on.
He is absolutely vulnerable that 2.5 million Ontarians do not have a family doctor. We saw this a couple of weeks ago, just outside of London, Ontario. People lined up for hours in the snow.
It's in Walkerton.
In Walkerton to try to get access to a family doctor that had said, I will take the first 500 people. How have we gotten to this place in Ontario? You know, when we start to look at every municipality, large, medium, small, northern, southern, urban, rural, who are dealing with encampments, those are things that are squarely at the hands of the Premier, at the feet of this government, and they don't want to talk about that. They don't want to talk about the issues about being Premier of the province of Ontario. The Premier wants to talk about everything but his responsibility. The Ontario at home, these are people who are getting palliative care at home. These are people who are getting home care, so they're not having to be in those hospitals that are crumbling and closing down.
They just fired the CEO.
And they had
the
to
other day.
fire the CEO because people couldn't get IVs and pain pumps and gauze. This was a government that talked about red tape reduction, and the only tape that was reduced was that was going to medical patients at home. Those fiascos are squarely at the feet of the Premier.
Let me get Dan on that. If it's not the early election call, where do you think he's vulnerable?
Yeah, I am less convinced the early election call is going to be what voters show up thinking about on election day. But the reality is, early or not, this is a bad time to be an incumbent, no matter where you are in the world, right? Governments across the world are being defeated. Here at home in Canada, I mean, we've seen it with Justin Trudeau. We saw David Eby have a much rougher ride in his election in British Columbia than anyone expected. And so the risk here is, I think, less in the early election call and more in being an incumbent. When you have all of the problems in this province right now, Ontario isn't feeling great about healthcare. It isn't feeling great about crime and safety. It isn't feeling great about affordability and getting a home and the encampments that Kim talked about. Like, this is a really risky move, I think, on the part of the Premier, simply because it is a dangerous time to be an incumbent government when you've got all these problems at your feet. And I think it will be difficult for them to run away from a lot of the challenges that they've created in our healthcare system in particular.
John, where do you think he's vulnerable, if not on the early call?
He's vulnerable on many things, but only if they become ballot issues. And I'm not convinced they are. I mean, what was the big issue last year? Wasn't it housing? And nobody's talking about housing now. And is that because they figured it actually takes 8 years to build something, or 20 if you're in Toronto? So, you know, complex problems.
But what's the ballot question then?
Well, like for Ford, it's you need me to protect you from Trump. For the other part, today, and here's the question, like early election call, unnecessary, wrong, punish the Premier.
I don't think it's that.
Well, no, the question for the parties is, how long do they stick with that before they give it up?
I think 3
and what
days.
do they go do next?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure they have anything.
No, I think the Liberals will spend a couple days on it. I think that there will be some attention on an early election call because it is topical. The media are going to be asking the Premier about it. And then it shifts to healthcare. And healthcare is going to be what the Liberals talk about the rest of the campaign.
But at what point do you stop, as Bonnie Crombie talking about the early election? Do you want the Premier to stay in his job?
I think if it sticks, Richard, like if in 3 days they can make it stick and they can get people talking and upset about an early election call, they'll stick with it. Otherwise, they're going to pivot to healthcare. And they're going to talk about healthcare the entire time.
We in the media gallery, of course, are going to continue to ask about that. But I mean, you're asking about issues the Premier may be, or that Doug Ford may be vulnerable on. And the Financial Accountability Office served one up, I guess, on Monday. And that's a story I've covered a lot, the alcohol in corner stores, that it's costing Ontarians $600 million more just to speed it up 400 days. You know, my fellow reporters asked the Premier about that today at his campaign launch in Windsor. I argue he didn't have a great answer, just that same talking point, well, we want to bring more convenience to Ontarians. Is that an issue Ontarians care about? I don't know, but it's one he could be vulnerable.
And it becomes where it becomes interesting is, what could that opportunity cost have been? Had you spent the $2 billion that they've had to spend on Ontario Place, could that have been better served into recruiting more doctors? I mean, they had that flurry of announcements just before he went to the LG that said, oh, it would be 1.9 million. Okay. So if you're going to not spend on what Ontarians asked you to spend on, which is healthcare, education, and instead get bad deals all over the place, then you shouldn't be Premier. That's when it becomes, who else is on that table? What is that energy? And where everything before today, was, in a sports analogy, was the regular season.
It's the playoffs now.
We're now in the playoffs. And the playoffs are where everyone either steps up or goes home. And that's just why those launches today were so important, being able to frame that, who you want to have as your premier, and what does that start to look like, so it becomes more of that bigger conversation.
But if you go with that analogy, the regular season has said the premier is going to win the playoffs and win the championship because the other party leaders have failed miserably to turn the page to their agenda or their issues or their ballot question. My bigger concern, Steve, is that rather than an issue, it's going to be complacency. It's going to be like, yeah, I support the premier. So if a pollster calls me, hey, yeah, I'm supporting Doug. But when am I planning on going to vote?
Yeah.
Oh, what's the weather? Doesn't matter what the weather is on February 27th, it's going to be cold. So maybe I don't worry about it because I read all these polls that the premier is going to win a lot. And if you look at how the votes went in the last election, the premier lost a lot of votes between the first and second elections.
That's right.
And if he is on track to lose even a percentage of that, it's going to be a very crazy election night.
Okay.
Yeah,
Let me
I don't
put the
think
spotlight.
sorry, Steve, go ahead.
I'm just going to, I actually want to go to you, Dan. I want to put the spotlight on Bonnie Crombie for a second here. I'm going to ask her this question when she comes up after this discussion here. She's the only major party leader who, till now, has not had a seat. So she had to make a decision about where to run. She decided Mississauga East Cooksville is the seat she is going to seek. It's an open seat at the moment. There's no former sitting member there. The Conservatives are running Patrick Brown's mother-in-law against her, which is an interesting choice. What's going on there? Can you sort of scratch below the surface on the subtext of the drama going on there?
No, I'm not an expert in Mississauga politics, but Bonnie Crombie sure is. She was elected by big majorities to the position of mayor in that city for many years. And I think she's going to perform very well in that seat and perform very well in that region. I mean, this is a region that Liberals need to win back. It's a core part of when Liberals form government. They do very well in Peel region. So it's going to be really important that she performs well there. I think she is able to connect with that community, but it's also a community that votes with momentum, right? And I think this is where the reality is voters aren't going to really tune into this election. Your viewers are. You've got well-educated and tuned-in voters, Steve. Most voters in this province aren't going to pay attention until probably after Family Day, when we have a debate and we have sort of the final leg of the campaign. And the reality is who's got the momentum going into that final week is going to be really important. And you're right, if the polls are the same as they are now, the premier looks like he's going to run away with it, that will certainly demotivate his voters, demotivate a lot of voters, frankly. But if Bonnie Crombie can get sort of some momentum heading into the weeks after Family Day as the obvious challenger to Ford, which voters in this province know Liberals are, I think we'll have a really good shot on Election Day.
I want to ask Sabrina about this. We know that there is a great rivalry between Bonnie Crombie when she was the mayor of Mississauga and Patrick Brown as the mayor of Brampton. They're the two big mayors in Peel region, and they had very different visions for the future of Peel region. The Conservatives won every seat in Halton, Peel, and York in the last election. How big a risk do you think it is for Bonnie Crombie to try to run and win a seat in Mississauga?
I mean, obviously, I think Bonnie Crombie is very popular in Mississauga, right? Like, she was the former mayor there, but at the same time, the Conservatives picked up a lot of those seats in Brampton and Mississauga. They poached those seats from the NDP in 2022 as well. So, I think Mississauga East Cooksville, when you look at 2022, that was the closest race in the region. You mentioned, former Conservative Khalid Rashid is no longer there. So it does seem like it would be her safest bet in that spot. But you're right, there's no love lost between her and Patrick Brown. And now that, Patrick Brown's mother-in-law is running against her, who's also a very good organizer too, in local PC circles there. I mean, she's definitely got her work cut out for her. They're not going to make it easy for her. The Conservatives, as has been mentioned, have been spending millions of dollars, on attack ads and targeting those in the 905. The 905 can make or break governments. And to Dan's point, that is a crucial region for all of the parties. The NDP, wants to take back that territory. The PCs need to hold on to it. And the Liberals, if they even want to make, recognized party status, which they don't have, which you need 12 seats for, it comes with a lot of resources and money, makes your job as a party leader a lot easier. I think that's a crucial region for all parties.
Now we've got to put something to you about your party and your leader.
I'm excited.
We've had 43 elections in the province of Ontario, and 41 of them have been won by Liberals and Conservatives.
Hear, hear.
Only two not. I put this to Merritt Stiles last time I did a one-on-one with her in the studio, and she is well aware of the history and the math. How does the NDP make a breakthrough in a province which only once in 157 years has given them the keys to the throne at Queen's Park?
So when I start to look at what happened in 1990, right, we were in this trade battle with the United States. This was an existential threat for a lot of communities like my own hometown that has a manufacturing base that was going to be challenged by that. Ontarians also looked at what was being put on offer, what were the alternatives, and the New Democrats were bringing forward really great ideas on housing, on healthcare, all sorts of things. So fast forward, I look at what Merritt Stiles is bringing to the table. Again, that campaign war chest, those 220,000 unique donors across the province, going into unconventional or non-traditional New Democrat places over the last while, getting a really great reception. Understanding that when somebody asked me about province-wide polling, two things I'll say about that. This is a very big province, and the regional breakdowns are quite interesting. This is a battle of Kitchener, Waterloo to Windsor. This is a Northern Ontario battle. This is places even like Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke, where the New Democrats came in second last time and will come back stronger because it's now also an open seat. People are seeing what Merritt launched today, and people were going, "Who is she? This is interesting.
Okay,
Let's go."
in which case, how come the Premier never mentions her? How come all the ads are only about the Liberals?
That's right.
Because why would you want to give oxygen of the person you're actually afraid of?
Oh, please. Come on, Kim. You're really reaching now.
Dan,
Look,
Dan,
what I'll say is the only time New Democrats...
Let her finish.
With all due respect for your interruption of me, I mean, you made the same big swings and a miss with Stephen Del Duca last time, who couldn't get a seat, didn't have a seat, couldn't win a seat. I've seen people like John Tory, former PC leader, who didn't have a seat, going, "I'm going to take on Kathleen Wynne. Let's go over, Bonnie does not have momentum, a seat. She couldn't get people to show up around her today. And I appreciate that you're going to go and say, but the polls, the province-wide polls, last election, the New Democrats and the Liberals had almost exactly the same polling on election day. And the New Democrats were official party and had all sorts of seats, and you didn't have an official party again.
Okay, let's let Dan respond.
I'll emphasize the fact that the Premier talks about Bonnie Crombie a lot, the media talk about Bonnie Crombie a lot, the attack ads talk about Bonnie Crombie a lot, and there is a reason for that. It's because she's a charismatic electric leader that people are going to be paying a lot of attention to throughout this campaign. The only time that voters in this province voted for New Democrat, you talk about the one election when New Democrats won, it wasn't because they had great ideas, it was because voters were fed up with the other two options and they protested. They accidentally elected Bob Rae Premier for 5 years. And look, it was a stunning victory at the time, but it was a protest vote. It wasn't about anything else. People know in this province, Liberals are the only ones who can be conservative.
And if I can just add, as someone who remembers watching that debate, I went, wow, this young guy who's in a better suit than the other two.
This is Bob Rae, you meant.
Bob Rae. Bob Rae looked the part. He sounded the part. He was optimistic. And people in that election went, because I did a lot of polling back then, we'll give the new guy a try. Now, turned into a nightmare. But, and that's the question for me, for Merritt this time, is if she is the same whiny, miserable, unhappy message of the last four campaigns, then they better not have, shouldn't have changed leaders. If she comes out with optimism and some kind of positive policy, presents a positive alternative, then I think that's true of either leader.
Look, I don't think voters have any idea that the NDP changed leaders.
Okay.
I think that's the reality.
We're running out of time here, and I want to make sure, Richard, I get a chance to talk about the Greens as well, because they've got two seats right now. Mike Schreiner's in Guelph, Aisling Clancy's in Kitchener Centre, which she won in a by-election. She's never actually won that in a general election. Do they have the potential of picking up a third seat or more in this election?
Well, Sabrina knows this. In the media gallery at Queen's Park, if you're looking for a clip, as we say, a good quote from a leader, you go to Mike Schreiner. The guy knows how to encapsulate a message. They have a strong leader. There's no question about that. Do they have enough traction to pick up another seat? I'm not so sure. I'd be interested to know what the politicos on the panel think about Schreiner maybe not taking that top Liberal job. Do you think there's any regret in the Liberal Party, or regret with Mr. Schreiner?
Well, I mean,
Among
he had a
Liberals
seat, at least.
for Mike running? No, I don't think so. Look, he is a very nice guy. He performs pretty well in the debates. The reality is Greens just can't translate their notional support that they might have out there into any sort of electoral success. I think voters tend to vote Green when they don't know how to vote they don't want to vote for another party and they want to show up and vote.
Okay. A couple of minutes to go. Let me ask, John, to you first. If you're advising Doug Ford, do you tell him to skip the leaders debate because he's got such a big lead?
It's in his best interest to skip the debate, but I'm not a personal believer in that. I think especially the Premier, you should be at the debates. I think that there's a problem, and certainly parties are insisting on this with all their candidates. Don't go to debates if you're the government, or the presumed government in the federal case. And I think that says something poorly about the parties, that they don't have faith in their candidates. They don't have faith in their training of the candidates and who they recruited to speak for their parties. And certainly Doug Ford is not afraid of anybody on any given day. And if he's let's be clear, he's willing and able to sit across the table from Donald Trump. He may not get the opportunity, but he's certainly going to have no problem going to a debate.
Yeah.
Gotcha. That's our time, friends. Mr. Director, can I get a wide shot so I can thank all of our guests for coming into TVO tonight for day one of the 44th general election in the province of Ontario. Stay safe on the hustings, everybody, and we'll see you by the 27th of February. Good night, all. It's day one of the 44th Ontario general election, and it's not an exaggeration to say the newest member of the Queen's Park Leaders Club has a daunting mission ahead of her. Bonnie Crombie has been the Liberal leader for just over a year, but unlike the other leaders, she is now seeking a seat for the very first time and very much hoping to bring her party back to official party status or more, which it hasn't had for 2 consecutive elections. Let's find out what's up her sleeve, shall we? Here's the Liberal leader for the Ontario Grits, Bonnie Crombie. Welcome back to TVO.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Well, for the last 13 months, you've probably been asked about 1,000 times, so where are you running? Where are you running? And you always said, somewhere in Mississauga. Now we know, Mississauga East Cooksville.
That's correct.
Why that seat?
You know what? I love my city. I love every corner of Mississauga, and I can't wait to put my name on a ballot to represent the people of Mississauga once again. So it could have been anywhere, quite frankly, but we had very strong candidates come forward in the other ridings, and so it's Mississauga's East Cooksville, and I'm really excited. It's close to home. I know the issues. I know the people. Of course, I've had a huge presence in the community for many years. Attended all the barbecues and picnics and ribbon cuttings.
You saw who they're running against, Jay.
I did see that. I don't know if it was...
Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown's mother-in-law.
Yes, yes. Well, they were always going to run someone. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Is she tough competition for you?
Well, everyone's tough competition. I take every race seriously, and I work very hard to win, and I will win my seat and hopefully win the election too.
Let me ask you one more about that, and then we'll get on to issues, because look, you're a huge name in Mississauga, there's no question about that, but the PC party in the last election won every single seat in Mississauga and Brampton and Halton.
Yeah.
So, clean sweep.
Yeah.
Did you consider maybe running somewhere else and not in Mississauga given that?
Yeah, no, never. Mississauga's my home. It's where I built my political career. I love the people of Mississauga. And our candidates, even in the last election, came a very strong second. So I know they're going to win this time.
Okay, on to the biggest issue for day one, to be sure, and that is the election call 16 months early.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
Well, let me say off the top, I'm not fighting Doug Ford on tariffs. I'm fighting him on Doug Ford's Ontario and what he's done to our province since he became Premier 7 years ago. And, I ask people every single day, is their life more affordable today? And the answer is no, not in Doug Ford's Ontario. I think it's an unnecessary election. I think it's quite reckless to hold an election right now. I don't see another premier across this country who would consider this action when we need calm, stability, a firm but calm resolve. We need security, and we need to have a united front to present to the federal government, who will present our perspective when negotiating south of the border with President Donald Trump.
That's why he's calling the early election. He says he needs a refreshed mandate to deal with the Trump tariffs.
We can talk about that. That refreshed mandate will cost the people of Ontario $175 million. That on top of the $7 billion of waste that we've uncovered, and we can talk about that as well. It's unnecessary and it's reckless. He has a strong mandate. That's what we call a majority government. He gets to govern until June 2026. That is what a majority government is. To throw us into an election now is really reckless. We need him here at home, protecting jobs, creating jobs, working with the federal government, and having a united front to present that united front.
He has been getting some decent notices for the way that he is sort of talking tough at Trump in a way that I guess a lot of people say the federal government has not, because there's a power vacuum there with the Liberal leadership happening right now. Do you give him any props for the way he's handling the Trump situation?
What I don't give him props for is the way that he's handled Ontario. When I look around, I hear from people, because I'm present in the community. I go into the grocery store, into the local metro and the pharmacy, and I see moms putting meat back in the freezer. I see people not purchasing things because they can't afford them, and they'll say, "Oh, Bonnie, you're our former mayor. You've got to do something. I can't pay my rent and my cell phone bill and buy groceries at the same time." That's the reality of Ontario today. The 2.5 million people don't have access to a family doctor. We know that another 3 million may not, because their doctors are of retirement age. Our healthcare system is crumbling. Our education system is crumbling. We see overcrowded classrooms. The infrastructure, the school buildings themselves are crumbling. People are losing the dream of owning their own home. Steve, I've got 3 kids. 2 of them got married this summer.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And those 2 both want to start a family and purchase a home. And they said, "Mom, you've got to do something. We've lost the dream of owning a home." And so I challenged my team, and we can talk about that policy. We will. So when I look at, Doug Ford said he'd end hallway medicine. He didn't get it done. He said he'd lower taxes, and he didn't get it done. And he said he would build 1.5 million homes, and he didn't get it done. Quebec, Alberta, and BC are eating our lunch. They're eating our lunch. They're, building 30% more homes than we are. We're a drag on the national average. This has been the worst year, last year, 2023, since 1955. So he didn't get it done. This is the state of Doug Ford's Ontario, but he would prefer to argue on the basis of, national unity and fly the flag. And let me say, wearing a ball cap and slapping a label on it is showmanship. It is not leadership. And what we need right now is strong leadership in the province of Ontario.
Okay, you've raised a bunch of things. Let's start to pick those apart.
Okay.
Healthcare. Yes, you're right. 6.5 years ago, he pledged an end to hallway healthcare. Clearly, that has not happened. However, I did see the former Liberal cabinet, the Liberal health minister, federally,
right.
Jane Philpott, have a news conference with the deputy premier and health minister Sylvia Jones the other day, in which the former Liberal health minister gave Ford kudos for what he was trying to do on primary care reform. Again, do you give him any props for that?
Well, let's say he turned to a Liberal to help him reform health care.
He
Let's
did.
start there.
That's true.
The issue is this, Steve. Too little, too late. He said 7 years ago he was going to fix hallway medicine, which means, improving hiring more nurses, hiring more doctors, improving access to primary care teams and family docs. If we had more family docs in Ontario right now, people wouldn't be waiting in hospitals to be seen 10 and 12 and 15 hours. Can they fix that? They can have the budget to fix it if they didn't waste so much money. So yesterday they acknowledged finally that a great deal, 300,000 people in Ontario didn't have access to a family doc. The number's more like 2.5 million, but okay, they've made that acknowledgement. And they put a number to it. That number, 1.9 billion, is the same number they wasted on expediting the sale of beer and wine. That would have bought 1,400 family docs. That's where I would have invested the money, and I will do that day one, because my pledge to people is a family doc within 4 years. That's my priority. I think what we need to do is get the basics right in Ontario. Healthcare, education, and building homes, making life more affordable for people. That's what you will see in our platform when we release it. I'll say it again, healthcare, education, affordability, and building homes. Those are the basics of a foundation of a prosperous economy. Not running around and pretending you're waving a flag. It's not even, let's be honest, Doug Ford has a very small role in this. He's providing input to the federal government. Our Prime Minister, while he's still our Prime Minister, and Dominic LeBlanc, our Finance Minister, will lead this charge and will be doing the negotiations.
Let me follow up on
Not Doug
healthcare.
Ford.
I'll follow up on healthcare in as much as I've talked to pollsters who say healthcare is so complicated and people don't believe anybody can solve it regardless of party stripe. Mm-hmm. So if you want to make the focus of your campaign healthcare, is that a shot across the wrong bow in as much as you may think you've got a good story to tell. He thinks he's got a good story to tell, but the public doesn't seem to think anybody's got a good story to tell.
I disagree. I think that healthcare is the key issue facing Ontarians today. Look, what we saw in Walkerton 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, over 1,000 people were lined up outside an auditorium to register for the newest family doctor. We saw seniors with their walkers, some in wheelchairs, bundled up in parkas. We saw moms with young children in their snowsuits, in their strollers, waiting 6 hours in a snowstorm for access to a family doctor. So I will challenge you that that is not the case. People want proper health care when they need it.
But what makes you think you can do better?
Because I have a plan, and we'll put the resources and financing behind it. I won't waste $7 billion, the $2 billion that we saw on expediting beer and wine to his buddies, the CEOs of Costco and Walmart and 7-Eleven. That was $2 billion waste of money, and the FAO confirms that number.
Financial Accountability Office.
That's correct.
Yeah.
He's a government watchdog. Then we saw $2 billion wasted to a foreign-owned spa at Ontario Place. And then, if I may, $3 billion wasted on pre-election checks. That's $7 billion wasted. Our plan is $3 billion. And that money clearly exists since it was frittered away on giving taxpayers money back to them. Listen, I'm all about giving money back to people because I plan to cut their taxes. And we can talk about that as well.
Let's follow up. What taxes would you cut?
And we will. However, the $200 check is great this month. It'll top up your groceries, maybe help you with your rent. What about next month? So our plan is to cut family income, middle income earners by 20%. So everyone earning their first $75,000 and less will see a 20% reduction in their taxes. I'm also going to take the HST off home heating and hydro. We're also going to cut.
Can you do that? You have to get the Fed's permission to do that.
I can do that. I'm also.
Well, you need the Feds to do that. Right? With a harmonized sales tax, you can't do that on your own.
They're going to take it off. The federal portion will take it off the provincial portion. And we're going to cut small business taxes in half. Right, from 3.2% to 1.6%. That is $1,050 back to people annually, almost $100 every month, not a $200 check once.
So let me ask you the bigger philosophical question here, which is, it is an interesting strategy for Liberals to try to play the tax cut game against Conservatives because Conservatives think they own that issue.
Well, they don't.
Well, I was going to ask, are you, in the same way that it's dangerous for them to compete with you guys on health and education, is it dangerous for you to try to compete with Conservatives on tax cuts?
I'm a different kind of Liberal. I think we've established that.
Well, you're wearing blue for starters. That's one thing.
Didn't realize that, but thanks. You know, I'm very centrist, middle of the road. I'm worried about all Ontarians. I'm very fiscally responsible. As you know, as mayor, my training was under Hazel McCallion, who we both adore, and the anniversary of her passing is today. And so we're thinking about her. And I've never run a deficit because I wasn't able to as a mayor. Municipalities can't do it. So for me, whatever revenue you earn is the money you spend, and it has to go to the greatest good. So those are my principles. People should understand that I was a business person for the first 20 years of my career in my life as well. I have an MBA, a director's degree. I sat on a lot of boards, public and private boards, and I led the city very competently. Our tax rates were very low because we were very careful. We were strong stewards of people's money. So I'm very fiscally responsible, but of course I'm socially progressive. I'm a different kind of Liberal because I'm going to have policies for business people, for businesses as well. I'm a business person by background. So it's a different orientation than we have seen in the past from Liberal leaders.
So when you first won the leadership, and you were here 13 months ago,
That's right.
and I said to you, or I asked you, is your party too woke? Has it been in the past? And you said yes. And I said, okay, where's the evidence that it's going to be a more centrist sort of radical middle party.
Now you're seeing it.
Now we're seeing it.
Now you're seeing it. As the platform is evolving and we're rolling out policy, it took a little while to get there, and don't forget I did travel the province over the past year, listening to people and their issues. I particularly love going into the small towns and the northern communities. I love talking to the farmers and hearing what their needs are. It's been a long time since Liberals talked to farmers. And I said, we're going to be there for you when it comes to business risk management, when it comes to protecting farmland, when it comes to succession planning. They need abattoirs, the beef farmers. I understand their issues and I want to speak to them and I want to help the farmers of Ontario as well.
Let me ask you about this, and this is your first campaign as leader.
That's right.
You were a member of Parliament,
I was.
which meant a lot of traveling from
Ottawa.
Mississauga to Ottawa and
That's
back.
right.
And then you were city councillor, so that was a lot of within Mississauga, and then the mayor of Mississauga, which was a lot of within Mississauga. Now you are traveling across, there are some ridings in this province that are the size of France and Germany combined, right? It's massive. What surprised you the most about having to go all over the place as party leader?
And what a beautiful and wondrous province we have with so much potential. All these small towns, and some of them once so prosperous, but maybe not so much anymore. What struck me is the issues were on parallel with everything I see in the larger urban centers. And let's not forget, I was chair of the big urban mayors, so I know acutely well the issues of the big city mayors. But the smaller towns and smaller municipalities and the northern communities were new to me. And my gosh, so beautiful. But at the same time, the issues that we're experiencing here, access to family doctor, access to health care, classrooms that have strong educators with education assistance in them, with good, strong infrastructure involved, the cost of housing, the cost of building, supply chain issues, affordability. If we think things are not affordable here in the South, in the GTA, imagine what it's like in Kenora and Rainy River and further north in Sioux Lookout when they're flying food in. We think, I've seen $6 head of lettuce here that, of course, I couldn't afford to purchase, but imagine what it is up there. It's so much more expensive. So the issues we're seeing here are far more acute. When we talk about the inability to build homes, even tougher in the north. We've got to fix those issues. We've got to solve them. And luckily, I have a plan.
Every poll I've seen, and we don't spend a lot of time here talking about polls, but every poll I've seen has Doug Ford and the Conservatives in first place.
Yeah.
If he's been as awful as you seem to think he has been, why is that the case?
I don't think people were paying attention. I'm going to answer this question rather than brush it off. I think they've also spent hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising, the provincial ads, ads about me, etc. But people weren't really engaged. I think they were also more focused on federal issues in the federal political game. And I've seen and I've heard from all my candidates at the doors, there's been such a significant shift lately. When we're door knocking, people want to engage. They're hearing it's real and they want to talk about it. They're hearing about those federal candidates. Hey, some of them are really interesting. Let's talk about those. Oh, your province, is that Bonnie Crombie woman from Mississauga? Seeing her on TV. Yeah, she's talking about health care. Thank goodness somebody is. It's shifted at the doors, and I'm really pleased about that. And let's be honest, the only thing that matters is the poll on election day. But I'm going to be talking about the issues that matter to Ontarians because I want to fix the basics. Because you know what? If you can't get the basics right, you don't deserve a job. But you can't focus on the other things. And I want to build a prosperous economy. This is the business person in me, and this is the mayor in me too. Attracting investment from the outside to come in to create jobs so everyone can thrive. And I remember attracting, there was a life sciences company that had signed with New Jersey. So I just want to suggest to you, I've done negotiation from different levels of government with different levels of government, business to business, and also across the border as well. They were going to New Jersey and they were Brazilian based. And I flew over there to meet that CEO and I explained the benefits of investing in Canada and then talked about how great Ontario is, but Mississauga was the key. And after I spoke with them, they broke the deal. And Mississauga got that $58 million investment. That's the kind of mayor I was. That's the kind of premier I will be. I'm going to go eyeball to eyeball and cut deals with CEOs to bring investment here to Ontario.
When you were the mayor, that was a nonpartisan job. You are now the head of a political party. and if I may say, a political party whose brand has been really quite damaged by how long Justin Trudeau remained as Prime Minister when, by the end, I think 80 or 90% of his caucus wanted him out. How much of an albatross around your neck has he been? Is he continuing to be as you press your case?
I will say, as I had just said to you, that things are really changed at the doors, even from the past month. There's a real warm reception. They're eager to engage on issues that matter to them. And we're hearing about, number one, healthcare. Can you get me a family doctor? I was in the grocery store yesterday, Steve, and Bonnie, you were our mayor. Can you help me? I don't have a family doctor. Do you know anyone that might be taking new patients? Number one, access to medicine, access to a family doctor, a healthcare team, or lowering wait times in the hospital. Number two, our education system, crowded classrooms, education assistants not present, affording a home, affording their rent, affording their groceries. These are the issues that matter to Ontarians, and these are the issues that we are going to address in our platform.
So in our last minute then, what's the ballot question as far as you're concerned?
Doug Ford's had Doug Ford's had 7 years, in fact. He said he'd get it done. He didn't get it done. I ask you, is your life more affordable today than it was 7 years ago? Clearly the answer is no. He doesn't deserve to be reelected. He said he'd end hallway health care. He didn't get it done. He said he'd cut taxes. He didn't get it done. I will. He said he'd build 1.5 million homes. He didn't get it done. I will. He wants to distract with playing on the Team Canada. The basics are crumbling here in Ontario. This is where his focus needs to be and should have been for the past 7 years. Not on booze, which he loves, bike lanes, big spas, and rich buddies, because that's been his focus, the Bs. Not the basics. I'm about the basics.
A different B.
A different B, getting the basics right.
Gotcha. That's Bonnie Crombie, the Liberal leader for the province of Ontario, seeking personal election in Mississauga, East Cooksville. As I will say to all the leaders when they come in, stay safe on the campaign trail, and thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, January 29th, 2025. Tomorrow, we'll take the pulse of the province with pollster Aaron Kelly and talk radio hosts from across Ontario. Hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
We are where you are. TVO's current affairs journalism is available across platforms across Ontario, on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and more. Catch The Agenda, The Thread, On Poly, and other podcasts, docs, and video series on the device of your choice when you choose.